But this Sunday, we're going to continue with our series, learning about the practice of Sabbath. And the focus this Sunday is on rest. And I would like to start by reading you a poem. Slow us down, Lord, still our restless spirits. Calm our racing minds. Center our being. Let our longing linger. Let it take root and create a beautiful yearning space that has the time to ache. Let our longing linger. What is your longing? What is your yearning? And what do you ache for? Sally Foster Fulton wrote that poem, and maybe that's a new name for many of us, but she works with the Church of Scotland and other denominations, strengthening connections for the poverty relief charity called Christian Aid since 2016. And I believe her poem was written with desires that Christian truths and values be lived out, bringing more love, justice, and peace to our world. That was one of her longings. But what stirred in me and what I want to share with you is the question about what do you really ache for? What is your longing? Maybe you ache physically because years of life have taken their toll on our bodies and we are no longer able to do what we were able to do years ago or even 1 year ago. Or maybe you ache emotionally because there are regrets, there are unfulfilled desires or possibly shame that haunts your thoughts. Or maybe your ache is more relational for friends or for family who are not making or have not made decisions that you would be in favor of and what you had hoped for. Or maybe you experience an ache for losses, for how life has changed, without the people, maybe the places or times or dreams that you once were able to share with others. So whatever you identify with today, I trust that you will also leave with an ache and a longing to experience Sabbath rest. That's what we're going to be talking about. And enough of an ache to be willing to consider what would be a Sabbath practice that you would commit to doing for the sole purpose of deepening your connection with God and also with others. The Jewish rabbi Abraham Heschel had a good way of defining that meaning and purpose of Sabbath rest. And he says, the practice of Sabbath releases God's blessing on us and comes when we stop wrestling with the world and care for the seed of eternity that is planted already in our souls. So we need to tend to that seed of eternity. And what does that actually mean? I believe it's pointing toward the God-created awareness and search for meaning and purpose and connection beyond this world, because we are all created in God's image and for relationship with Him. That's that seed of eternity that He has planted in us. And so this morning, as we look at how to attend to that seed, we're going to revisit the teaching in Scripture about Sabbath. And that's based on two great stories that give two different perspectives, but both of them equally important. And so I'm just going to read a passage in Genesis that I know is very familiar to you, Genesis 1:31, and then to chapter 2, verse 3. And this talks about when God established Sabbath practice. And God saw that all He had made, and it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work He had been doing. So on the seventh day, He rested from His work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it He rested from all the work of creating that He had done. After God created for 6 days, he finished his creation work. And he looked at it and he declared that it was all very good. And after that, he takes a day to rest. And that wasn't because God was exhausted from all that he had been doing, but it was so that he could be present and he could delight in his finished work. And then we read that he blessed that day and he declared it to be holy. That means that he declared that day to be honored or set apart or dedicated to him. So taking a Sabbath to take a day and set it aside from your ordinary work, that is what it means that we can also delight and rest in him. And he blesses and declares that to be holy. Pete Craig of 24/7 Prayer has a saying that is interesting about Sabbath rest. And he says, you do your best when you do less and allow time to rest. That's easy to remember, isn't it? You do your best when you do less and allow time to rest. So the Sabbath is a day to remember who God is and who we are in relationship to him. And if you think about it, how do we establish our identity? I really believe that our identity here is much more linked to what we do than who we really are. Because when you meet somebody for the first time and you're getting to know them and you're asking some questions, it doesn't take very long before you get the question, and what do you do? And that's when you might get a response like, oh, wow, that's quite amazing. Or you might get a response, oh, very interesting. Or if you have to respond that you've been a missionary, then you get this awkward silence. Because most people think that people become missionaries because they're hopeless at anything else that they can do. So taking a time to practice Sabbath is a time to remember our true identity. Because in God's eyes, we are his beloved children. And who we are becoming is just as important to him as what he has given us to do. So if we live tied to what the world recognizes as valuable and worthy, we will always have a desire, as John Mark Comer says, a desire for more income, more comfort, more benefits, more of whatever makes us feel maybe more recognized, more valued, or more appreciated. But the problem with that is that the desire for more never ends. There is always something else that we will see that could be more. And so it's only when we truly live into the truth that God controls and sustains the world that we also realize that God continues working when we take the opportunity to stop. And he doesn't depend on what we achieve or produce to accomplish his purposes. He desires to be present in what we do, but unless we have a rhythm of spending time also with him, we will lose our focus on what he desires to do in and through us. We need to constantly be reminded that we are God's beloved before we actually do or achieve anything. And God's greatest desire is to be in relationship with us, so that we will be able to live well and flourish in this beautiful world that he has given us. It's believing and daily responding to that invitation that will create that ache that I was talking about for Sabbath. An ache for a time to sit and give opportunity for God's presence to be personally experienced. And that is what Jesus was talking about when he said to his disciples, pray that God's kingdom will come on earth as it is in heaven. Because we are not just waiting for eternity to enter fully into God's presence, but the blessing of his presence is also for us now. And that is what we need to recognize and celebrate today, particularly this Sunday, as it is Pentecost. And it is the coming and giving of the Holy Spirit that we remember, and that the church was born, and that God invites us now into that personal experience that we are able to live in the presence of Jesus now and respond to him in that special way. So the first perspective or truth about Sabbath from Genesis is that God rested, and he rested to take time to delight in his own creation, and we are part of his creation. And that is why he invited us to take time and to do a Sabbath so that we could also delight in him. Genesis teaches us that God wanted us to have that weekly rhythm that separates time to intentionally spend and enjoy with him. And we can respond to that, or, we can ignore that desired pattern that God gave us. But just think about it when you are offered a gift, and Sabbath is truly a gift that he has offered us. It only makes sense to at least taste and see how good it is. The second story in Scripture about Sabbath is rooted in the Exodus. And when the Israelites were liberated from slavery in Egypt, they had just lived through centuries of working for Pharaoh, and they were never given a day that they could take off and rest during those hundreds of years. And after they crossed the Red Sea and entered into the wilderness, God said to them, "You are no longer slaves to Pharaoh, because you are mine. You are free. I have delivered you." And then he gave them, through Moses, their leader, the 10 Commandments, because they needed guidance and they needed instruction on how to now live together as a freed community and to flourish as God wanted them to be his people. So that's when we hear that Moses gave them the 10 Commandments, and it is the 4th commandment that he talks about the Sabbath. And so I'm just going to read that from the passage in Deuteronomy 5. Moses summoned all Israel and said, "Hear, Israel, the decrees and laws I declare in your hearing today. Learn them and be sure to follow them. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your ox, your donkey, or any of your animals, not any foreigner resting in your town, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do." And then this is interesting, because this is only found in Deuteronomy. It's not in when the 10 Commandments were given in Exodus. But it says here, "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." And when you think about it here, this was more than just a law that was given for the Israelites to obey. It was restoration for them. God was telling these people that they were going to have to stop, that in stopping, they would be able to take time to be with him. They would be able to listen to him and to remember that he was their creator and their deliverer. In other words, he was saying to them, I am not a Pharaoh. I am your God, and you are my people, and you are now free, but I want you to take a day to rest, some time to stop your ordinary work and to remember me, that I am your God and you are my people. This was a huge contrast to how they had lived for the last 400 years. They were not allowed to have a day of rest when they worked for Pharaoh. It was also a huge contrast to the other ancient Middle Eastern nations that surrounded them. The gods that those nations believed in and worshiped were only interested in the God's own comforts, their own pleasures, and they kept their people in bondage to satisfy their own desires, or they would punish them. But here Yahweh, the God of Israel, was saying to the Israelites, I'm not like that, and I'm not going to be like that. I am loving. I am caring. I am compassionate and generous. And I want you as my people to flourish. Take time, though, to be with me, to remember who you are and who I am, because I want to bless you. And I want to also make you a nation that will bless others. Well, that was thousands of years ago. So how does that apply to us today? We live in a free country, but the reality is that as humans, we can easily get attached to pharaohs in our lives and live not as free people, but as enslaved ones. We could be easily enslaved to our work. We could be enslaved to our finances or our investments, our mortgages, our retirement plan, to our pleasures, or to compulsions that we have, or the comforts that we desire. And that is in the course of practicing the way what John Mark Comer talks about when he says we need to resist those voices that we will hear from outer and inner pressures that work against us, trying to convince us that taking a Sabbath or taking time to just spend with God is really a waste of time. It's a loss of productivity and a loss of efficiency and a growing laziness that we could be experiencing. Those are the outer voices, but then there's the inner voices as well that constantly repeat insecurities and fears and want us to believe that we really are not worthy or deserving to take this time. Or maybe it is that we are even fearful to take this time, because if we stop and ask God to speak with us, we are afraid of what we actually might hear from him. What is he going to say to us? Rich Villodas puts it this way: when productivity is your God, rest feels like disobedience. It feels like betrayal, idolatry even. But what's needed is a recalibration, or rather a reimagination of what it means to be human and in relationship with God. Because to rest is to acknowledge our limits, and a Sabbath practice means stepping away from the compulsion that we have to accomplish and to just give space to quiet our thoughts, to enjoy unhurried delight, and practice deep trust in God, who truly is our ultimate provider. And when we read through the Old Testament about the history of Israel, we soon realize that when Israel obeyed God, when Israel took that time to stop and to listen and to respond to what God was guiding them to do, they flourished as a nation. But when they got away from that, they started to diminish. And eventually, once again, they were plundered by their neighbors and taken again into captivity. That's what we read through the prophetic books as well. Time and time again, the messages of the prophets were to draw the Israelites back to listen, to receive, to respond, and to be guided by what God desired for them. But obedience to take a Sabbath and to keep a Sabbath time wasn't the only problem for the Israelites. There also developed another tension around the practice of Israel, in Israel. Because over the years, the Sabbath commandment became an oppressive system. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law drew up endless lists of what counted for them as work and what was forbidden. They dictated how far one could walk, what they could or could not carry. In other words, what they were considering was a prohibition and they could not do during a Sabbath day. But with all that, the heart of Sabbath as God's gift of rest truly got buried under endless man-made traditions that they had made up. By the time Jesus came onto the scene, the Sabbath was like a battleground. The religious leaders prided themselves on their strict obedience to all of the rules, while the common people often felt crushed by the weight of those rules and rituals. And so some clung to ritual, but without any meaning, and others ignored the Sabbath altogether. But, the ritual or the removal missed the whole true purpose of what Sabbath was all about. And that was why I did our scripture reading in Mark chapter 2, because that was an illustration of what was happening during this time. And as you remember, it's a story about when Jesus was with his disciples and they were hungry, and as they walked through a grain field ready for harvest, the disciples started to pluck some of the heads of grain and to eat them. And that sounds fairly reasonable to do, but unfortunately it was the Sabbath day, and the Pharisees saw an opportunity for accusing Jesus of breaking the Sabbath law. And Jesus uses that Old Testament story to call their attention to how they truly misunderstood the whole meaning of Sabbath. He talks about when David was fleeing from Saul, and he and his friends entered the house of God for protection, for shelter, and they were starving, and they asked the high priest for something to eat. But all Abiathar had was the 12 loaves of bread that were put on the table for the week, and then at the end of the week, they were removed, and a new set of 12 breads were spread out on the table. But the thing was that only the priests and their families could eat that bread that had been removed from the temple. So David asked, his men were starving, and the high priest gave them that showbread, those 12 loaves of bread, so that his men could eat. But we don't hear in Scripture that the high priest or David or his men were judged for what they did. It was not considered that they were disobeying the law. And when Jesus said that, the Pharisees would have remembered that story. They knew their scriptures. And he said it because he wanted them to understand that he was not denying the sacredness of the Sabbath when he allowed his disciples to pluck the heads of grain to eat. But he was really revealing its true meaning, because God established the Sabbath to bless mankind, not to create a fear or a bondage, but to celebrate freedom and delight. And yes, the Sabbath had sacred significance, and Jesus knew that, but it was never designed to deny mercy or compassion for somebody who was desperate and needed help. That's why we also read that Jesus healed on the Sabbath. He gave sight to the blind, and he strengthened the withered hands, and each miracle was an example that true Sabbath rest was not going to be found in rules, but he was coming and he was Lord of the Sabbath, and true Sabbath rest would now be found in him. Jesus' example also pointed forward to the ultimate rest all believers will share forever with him. And that's why we read the verse in Hebrews chapter 4. Because Sabbath is not just about rest from work, but it's about finding and experiencing true rest in God. Hebrews 4 says, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For anyone who enters God's rest also rests from their works, just as God did from his. So I know there's a lot of different ideas here, but putting all these passages together, Sabbath rest can be described not only as a practice we keep, but also as a way of living, a way of surrendering our lives to God by trusting in him rather than constantly striving with our own efforts. It can also be described as a way of being attentive to understand and to receive God's grace rather than trying to prove our worthiness. understanding and receiving God's grace rather than trying to prove our worthiness. It's a way of being still and daily dwelling in the presence of Jesus with us. Sabbath rest is found in the presence of God and realizing that He desires to be with us and allow us to experience that. It's that way that allows us now to experience what it'll be like when we are with Him. We don't have to just wait for eternity, for the fullness of that to happen. But as we take time to be still, as we take time to quiet our minds and our thoughts, and to say, here I am, what do you want me to hear from you? We can experience God's presence with us. And we look forward to that day when we will have that in its fullness, that is for sure, because then our work will no longer be the painful toil that it is nowadays, or done by the sweat of our brows, to just gain sufficient resources and provide for our families. But we will enjoy that ultimate realization and purposefulness of life's work and rest that God designed for us from the beginning of creation. You know, the first 10 years that I was in Bolivia, I was single, and I was involved in a lot of different ministries. I wasn't married then, and I didn't have a family. And I was young, and I had lots of energy. And so I was invited frequently to serve on different boards, different NGOs, invited to get involved with youth ministries and women's ministries, and also I was working full-time at the evening Bible school. And my life was full. I really enjoyed those days. I loved them. But at each season year end of the Bible school, work became so chaotic. There was just so much that was needed to finish the semester and prepare for a graduation ceremony. We had all the essays to be marked. We had all the exams to be graded. We had diplomas and certificates that we had to write, and we had invitations to send out, and we had speeches to prepare. And then, because I was a woman, I was in charge of getting the baking that would be available for serving the graduation tea. And Bolivia doesn't have Costco or Thrifties or anything that makes things a little bit easier, like cake mixes. So I can remember one year that I was just beyond being tired. And I can remember saying to one of my friends, I said, you know, I am bone weary, and when all this is finished, all I want is 24 hours to sleep. Well, it wasn't long after that I was in an accident. I was with a group of friends, and after church, we had taken a picnic lunch, and we'd hiked up to a portion of the Andes Mountains to take in that amazing beauty of them, and especially because there had been a fresh fall of snow. And we stayed up there a bit longer than anticipated, and, you know, as the sun was starting to set, the quickest way back down was to use our plastic market bags as a toboggan. Well, while sliding down, we lost control, but actually we never had control when we started sliding down. And eventually we flew through the air, off the side of the mountain, and landed on sheer rock. The fellow in front, he broke his leg, and I fractured 2 of my spinal vertebrae. But you know, it really was a miracle that no one had more serious consequences. But because of that, I was confined to lie absolutely flat in bed for 2 months. And I couldn't even raise my head until a back brace that they had ordered came from the States, and I had to use that for a year. So for my desire to get 24 hours of sleep, I got an awful lot more. And you know, it was a very humbling experience, as physically I had to rely on others for everything. It was a lesson to learn about pride and taught me a lot about receiving from others, especially because I really had nothing I could give them back in return. At least I felt that. I didn't choose a Sabbath when I should have chosen a Sabbath, and I was forced to stop. But during that time, I began to breathe again deeply that blessing of God's presence. And I was given the gift of spending hours and hours in conversation with God. And we can easily get a wrong idea about Sabbath. It's not so much another thing that is on our list that God is asking us to do. It is something that He is offering to give us. And until we stop long enough to receive it, we will never understand what we are missing. Eugene Peterson says that unless you are convinced that Sabbath rest is important, it is hard to do. It is hard to commit to. And from our experience, from Carlos and my experience working with spiritual retreats, or we could call them Sabbath rest days that we did in Bolivia, we saw tired, weary, frustrated, and hurting people come through our gates. And then by the end of the day, or sometimes at the end of a weekend, their whole countenance had changed because they had experienced God and He had ministered to them. It rarely was because of something supernatural or miraculous. It was just because they had taken time to stop, to rest, to read, to reflect, and respond to God. It was often just around talks at the table over a bowl of soup or a cup of coffee. Sometimes it was when we were washing dishes together after a meal. Or sometimes it was while they were walking the labyrinth to pray for guidance, that they heard that still small voice of God speaking directly and personally right into their hearts. And then what was so encouraging was that we began to see that in them there was a hunger for more days like that, more Sabbath time. And it started a disciplined practice that they continued in their lives. As I call the band back up, I would just like to repeat that poem that I read at the start of speaking with you. Once again, think about those questions. What is your hunger? What is your ache? As we read these words, slow us down, Lord. Still our restless spirits. Calm our racing minds. Center our being. Let our longing linger, and let it take root and create a beautiful, yearning space that has the time to ache. Let's just take a moment now to give that time to quiet our minds and to linger and to ask God those questions. What has He been stirring in you? What is the desire that maybe He has placed in you as you have realized that your life can get just far too busy and too much of a fast pace? Recognize that now as you speak to God in silent prayer. Ask Him, what do you want to say to me now? What do I need to hear from you? Maybe this week is a week where you can recognize what God has spoken to you, recognize that your life needs to take some time to rest. And you could also ask God about what practice you could start, about Sabbathing with Him, to give Him an opportunity, a bit longer of a time maybe, in a morning or in an afternoon, that you will give your undivided attention and allow him to meet with you. We will return to worshiping together, but during this time, if you feel that God has spoken to you and you would like to share that with somebody and ask for just their prayers, and as you pray, then I encourage you to go to the back corner, and there will be people there that would love to stand with you and to say, yes, I know what you're talking about. We all need this. May we trust God long enough to stop, to breathe, and to be attentive to him, because that is what he so desires, is to give you the blessing of his presence with you when you do take time for a Sabbath rest. May God bless you.